Hi, this is jazz artist Sherry Petta, and you can listen to my new single, Until the Real Thing Comes Along. And right now you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Here's the story of a lovely lady who hired a world-famous architect to design a small but spectacular house in Plano, Illinois, along the Fox River. Things didn't work out so well, and so unfortunately Dr. Edith Farnsworth's story has been told largely from the perspective of that world-famous architect. Joining us today to share Edith's story and what happened to the house are Professors Nora Wendl and Alice Friedman. And now, here's the story of a man not named Brady, your host, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Wow, it's hard to believe that the Brady Bunch TV series turns 53 in 2022. Although it had only a modest 5-year run, 1969 to 74, the show became an icon in popular culture. The dad, Mr. Brady, was the only architect on TV at the time, and the kind of sort of modernist house he designed for the family of 8, plus their housekeeper Alice, was an essential part of the show. But it wasn't quite real. The exterior of the house was located on Dilling Street in Studio City, California, but all of the inside was created on a TV soundstage. After the Brady Bunch ended, you may have missed the spin-offs. The Brady Bunch Hour, The Brady Girls Get Married, The Brady Brides, A Very Brady Christmas, The Brady Bunch Movie, A Very Brady Sequel, The Brady Bunch in the White House, and in 2019, HGTV's A Very Brady Renovation, which brought together the kids, now in their 60s, to renovate the inside of the real house on Dilling Street to look like the TV show. You get the real story of the house. And today, we get the real story of another famous house. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In Episode 8 of our ongoing space saga, it is a dark time. Despite epic happiness from the spread of in-and-out triple-double animal-style burgers all across the cosmos, the galactic classicists have closed down all the architecture schools, sending modernists into hiding. Rebel General Kate Wagner is desperate to find the brave Princess Angela Roll to lead the rebellion, but she has disappeared. General Wagner's chief pilot, the dashing and Danish former roofer Bjarke Shingles, has made an uneasy bargain with drug dealers on Soy, the vegan homeworld, to hijack an in-and-out freighter vessel in exchange for Angela's location. Meanwhile, at Port Calatrava, still under construction and over budget after 200 years, Brad Vader, an orthodontist on the Wookiee homeworld and the only son of Lord Justin Vader, gets a 23andMe test and discovers he is Angela's sister. Uh-oh. It's going to be an awkward Thanksgiving this year. Flashing back 800 years to here on Earth, modernist realtor Angela Roll uses her resourcefulness and architectural training to specialize in modernist houses, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to negotiating with vegan drug dealers. Hint, bring beef. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom. Whenever we talk to guests about the Farnsworth house, and we've talked to a lot of people, they all say, you really should talk to Nora Wendl. So we will. Nora is an associate professor of architecture at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque.
Go Lobos!
Her research uncovers overlooked or suppressed stories about design and construction for both built and unbuilt projects. With degrees from Iowa State,
Go Cyclones!
She is co-author of Ave Maria, a fascinating story of Catholic faith, Florida real estate, Domino's Pizza, and one of the world's largest Frank Lloyd Wright collections. She's working on a new book on Dr. Edith Farnsworth, plus an exhibition. Welcome, Nora.
Hi, thank you.
Historian Alice Friedman is the Grace Slack McNeil Professor of the History of American Art at Wellesley College.
Go Blue!
Where she is co-director of the architecture program. With degrees from Radcliffe, the University of London, and Harvard, she champions the role of women as clients in shaping modern architecture. Women like Constance Perkins, Vanna Venturi, Aileen Barnsdall, and Edith Farnsworth. She is the author of the 1998 book Women in the Making of the Modern House, A Social and Architectural History, as well as American Glamour and the Evolution of Modern Architecture. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Alice, before we get started, we had a hard time finding the team names for Radcliffe and the University of London. Do you remember what they were?
No, I don't. No, I really don't. Although the Radcliffe crew has its own mascot and its own crew name still, even though Radcliffe is part of Harvard. That's one thing I do know.
Okay. And what is their crew name? Do you remember?
No, I think they keep it as Radcliffe, even though there is no Radcliffe anymore.
The Radcliffes?
Yeah, and Wellesley has no mascot, as you very correctly pointed out. It's just a color.
It's just a color, yeah. It's very...
Yep. Go
it's
blue.
Very neutral about that.
Yep, go blue.
Go blue. Alice, let's start with some of these women that you have researched. Some of these names I think people don't generally know. Constance Perkins, Vanna Venturi, Aileen Barnsdall. Why don't we start with Aileen out in L.A.?
What would you like to know about her?
Tell us about Aileen and how she was the champion of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Well, she was a theater director, and her first love was theater, and she was a very wealthy woman and wanted to establish a theater community in Los Angeles on a very, very large piece of property, which was bounded by major north, south, and east-west streets in an, at that point, unbuilt part of Los Angeles. So she met Wright in Chicago, and when she figured out where her site was going to be, then she started working on this very elaborate program. She and Wright had a very conflicted relationship. This is not unusual, of course, between clients and architects anyway, but she was absolutely an independent woman and a little bit unreliable and in her travel and all sorts of things like that. So she and Wright were in conflict quite a bit because I don't think he was quite ready at that point for someone as independent as Aileen was. But in the end, they produced together quite an amazing house up on Olive Hill in Los Angeles.
The Hollyhock House.
The Hollyhock House, indeed. That wasn't her name for it. That was his name for it.
His name.
Yep.
And weren't there also some other buildings on the property?
Yes, it was a whole compound. It had theater directors' residences. It had an extensive villa-like structure in which she was going to live, but also where plays could be produced. And it had a menagerie for her daughter. It also, on the same enormous piece of property, they were intending to have artist studios and a cinema and a theater. Only a few of those buildings were actually completed because by the time things got going, Aileen Barnsdall decided that she was going to give the property to the city of Los Angeles. She was looking for somebody to take it off her hands.
And these days you can visit it. It's been renovated in the last few years.
It's beautiful.
Just gorgeous.
How is it being used now?
It's used as a historic house.
Okay.
And you can go on tours. There's wonderful interpretive lectures and even tours on the internet, I think. And the existing director's house is also used. There's also a part of the building is an art center that was added later, consistent with the original program. So there are art classes and all sorts of art-related activities on the site as well.
Now, Nora, how did you first come across the story of Edith Farnsworth?
I think it first crossed my path when I saw an article in the New York Times in 2003 that was announcing I guess it was sort of announcing the pending sale of the Farnsworth house. It was when the Farnsworth house was going up for auction. Peter Palumbo was putting it up for auction through Sotheby's. And the title of the article was A Story of Sex and Real Estate. And I read it, and it was so, like wildly speculative about Dr. Farnsworth's sex life that I was, obviously curious about its truthfulness. But it also led me to Alice's work. So I would say reading that article in the New York Times in 2003 was really my introduction, but it was followed quickly by doing a little bit of research and realizing that Alice had constructed an analysis of the history of the house through Edith's experience also.
The conventional story about the house, which of course is largely incorrect, was that the famous Mies van der Rohe had Edith Farnsworth as a client, and she was a very difficult client and possibly was in love with him, and there was a lawsuit, and things went back and forth, and she got represented over time like this, kind of stupid person who was getting in the way of this great genius. But all of that is pretty much baloney, isn't it, Nora?
Well, I would say that it's like a trope, I guess, of women, that if you're difficult, then I think women who, have ambitions or desires get painted in a unflattering light. Not even historically, I would say that's probably still happening. But, it wasn't even an historical project of transforming her into a difficult person. The first review of the house came out in October of 1951 in Architectural Forum, and that author described Dr. Farnsworth as a temporary tenant who would soon be gone, and then the house would belong to somebody who understood what it was really about. So
wow,
the project of making her, it was very insulting. Yeah, that came out in October of 1951. She had just taken ownership of the house and received the keys in March. So you can imagine that the narrative that she was a problematic person who didn't understand the nature of architecture and didn't appreciate her house, that was really a project that was unfolding while she was alive. And yeah, I think because that language and sort of talking ways of describing her existed, it made it easier for historians, not like Alice. Alice was really looking at the history of what actually happened, but it made it easier for historians who weren't actually doing the hard research to construct basically a sort of plot line that she was a difficult woman who had ambitions to, run off with the architect or something, and that was her reason for being unsatisfied with the house, which wasn't actually true at all.
Alice, you're working on a new book, Poker Face's Private Spaces, Houses for Unconventional Clients. Were there other women who were painted negatively in the same way for their patronage of architects?
Well, it's a really interesting question. When Nora was talking about this article about sex and architecture, I was thinking about how from almost all of the women clients that I've looked at, one of the first, narratives that is the speculation about their private lives, because they're heads of households. Those are the women that I'm looking at, these unconventional clients whose project was to build extraordinarily innovative houses. That was what Women in the Making of the Modern House was about. But in almost every case, except for Constance Perkins, who you mentioned, there was a lot of conflict with the architect, and then in subsequent historical analysis, a lot of speculation about the sex life of the woman client and also her instability in some respects, or her, inability to work through the difficulties of building a house. In the case of Aline Barnstall, she was very much of a diva, but she clearly was a diva with a clear vision of a innovative cultural project that she wanted to create, in which architecture played a very strong role. But as Nora said, it's a trope to point to the difficult client. Constance Perkins was not one of those.
Now, what house was she associated with?
She was the client for the Perkins House by Richard Neutra from the early to mid-50s in Pasadena, California. And she opted for a different strategy altogether. She befriended Neutra, and she was a kind of confidant for Neutra. And then she also dealt with the inevitable shortcomings or the inevitable difficulty of making the dream of the house and the budget come together. She dealt with that by doing a lot of construction work herself so that she could do what she wanted to do. And so they got along just fine. But it's rare.
Not typically the case.
No, not at all. She also was single, and people always described Constance Perkins as difficult as well, but Neutra didn't. She opted to take the strategy that she would befriend the genius architect because she understood art. She's also an artist herself, so rather than conflict, she associated herself closely with Neutra and then, disdained most other people who didn't understand modern buildings.
Sounds like she had some real people skills. She could sell notions and such to Richard Neutra.
Well, she was a teacher. She was a teacher at Occidental, and she taught studio and art history back a long time ago when that was still possible for people to do in art history departments. I don't know if she had people skills. She was an incredible snob. People described her as having a, very hoity-toity.
Okay. Maybe where it counted.
Yeah, she could turn it on when she wanted to.
Yeah, one person described her as having, since we're talking about the women's colleges, as having a Bryn Mawr accent.
Okay. But
the house that she built, where she ran into a problem was she didn't want to have a bedroom in her house. She didn't want to have a bedroom. She wanted to be able to sleep on a single bed in her workroom where she had a desk and a drafting table. But she couldn't get a mortgage from the bank for a house without a bedroom.
So it has something to do with resale value, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I interviewed her and I said, I think your bedroom, here I am, this young researcher saying, your bedroom's just beautiful. I love the way you conceived of it. And she, gave me the death stare and said, that is not my bedroom. That is the guest room. So it was always known to her as the guest room. And so she was able to get the mortgage, but she slept where she wanted to sleep, looking out one of her beautiful glass walls at a very small but very beautiful garden.
Now, Nora, let's go back in time and look at the story of Dr. Edith Farnsworth. How did she first come to choose Mies van der Rohe as her architect?
There's a lot of speculation about it. I mean, some people have said that she went to Philip Johnson, who was at the Museum of Modern Art, and asked for his opinion, and that Philip Johnson advanced Mies and other architects, and that she chose Mies for the proximity because he was in Chicago and she was also in Chicago. But she also, was friends with Harry Weiss, the architect, and his wife, who ran a furniture store, Baldwin Kingery. And she knew artists who were associated with the Art Institute already in Chicago. So it's hard to say whether, there are two camps of thought. One is that she contrived the meeting that they had where they happened to run into each other at a dinner party. There are others that say that, that she just was part of the same circles, and so running into somebody at a dinner party wouldn't be shocking. So it's hard to say. I think whether it was contrived or not, they met at a dinner party in 1945. And she had already purchased land, so she was planning on doing something, building a house west of Chicago in Plano, Illinois, or near Yorkville. So it's a good question. It's hard to know exactly how they ran into each other, but it was at that dinner party that in 1945, that she invited him to see if somebody in his office would design a house for her, is how she put it. And he told her that he would design it for her himself.
What was intriguing to him, do you think, about this commission?
Well, he was desperate. I mean, he'd been in the United States.
I love that question because I always, when I teach this house, I always say you should never say, would somebody in your office design that for me? Because the architect is always going to want to do it himself.
Exactly.
It was an amazing project.
Yeah, and he needed it. I mean, Alice is absolutely right. He really needed that project because it was he got to the U.S. in 1938 from Germany. He'd been in the U.S., I guess that would be until 45, so not about 8 years, 7, 8 years.
And things have been mighty slow at that point.
Well, he'd been doing work for IIT, right? He'd been doing some campus architecture, but, this is Mies van der Rohe. So this is considered to be the sort of final phase of his career when he moved to Chicago, and the work that I would say we know best in the U.S. is the work that he did from 1938 forward. So the Farnsworth House is really his first completed house in the United States. So for him, it was an important commission. He had lost a previous commission to design a house in Wyoming that was for the Reeser family. It was also a glass house. It was spanning a river, and the clients decided not to go through with that project. So he had glass house on the mind for sure.
Mm.
And the Farnsworth house was an opportunity to, resurrect that scheme. Of course, make it site-specific to Plano. But yeah, I think that was what was appealing to him.
So how was it in the beginning between Dr. Farnsworth and Mies? Was it good, or was it kind of cantankerous from the get-go?
No, I think they were very friendly. I mean, all of the accounts that I've read and, their oral histories with the men who worked in Mies's office who knew her well, they described her as a friend, that she would come to the office. She would actually have the young men in the office, they would draw charts and graphs for her that she needed visualizations for presentations she would give at conferences. She was an incredible researcher. She had a brilliant mind. She was trying to change the research around how to treat nephritis, which was a fatal kidney disease at the time. And so she was a friend of the office, is how they describe it. She would actually host picnics at the site on the weekend. So they describe her as packing cheeseburgers and red wine. And she would kind of pack up these meals, and she would drive a lot of people out to the site. It was a very friendly group.
And when did the conflict start?
I think, from what I can tell, I believe the conflict began when it perhaps became unclear to her how much things were costing. So how much things ended up costing. So she believed that the house would be $40,000, and then there was another quote, months later, well, the house is going to cost closer to $60,000, and then suddenly she had fulfilled invoices upwards of $70,000.
Oh, boy.
And I think at that point she started to feel like it wasn't clear to her when this would end. And, it's a custom piece of architecture. It's one of the most important houses in the U.S., if not the world. And so I think she understood that this was going to be an important house. I think if you had asked her at the outset, do you want to sign up to design or pay for a monument, I don't know that she would have signed up for that. So I think it was the cost and the sort of endlessness of it that it wasn't quite clear. She describes in the transcripts of the trial, I love the way she puts it. She said, I wasn't aware that we were on a cross-country journey without knowing where we were going, is how she puts it, because she felt really confused. Invoices kept showing up, and I think the final straw was an invoice from an electrician that was something like $4,000, and this was in 1951. That was the final bill, and
Huge.
She said,
Yeah.
I'm not paying this. Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Like,
Some houses were
What is-
going for that much money at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think she just said, what is happening? And
So-
I think that for her was the final straw.
Was it because she had lots of revisions that made changes to the design, or Mies was a lousy estimator, or?
No, I think what happened is they weren't, it was an experimental house. It started out as one size, and then they made estimates for 3 different sizes. She chose a size based on, an estimate of price. And then I think that it was supposed to be a concrete floor deck. And then Mies said, well, what about this travertine marble? And I think that things like that just kind of kept happening. It was, well, you could do concrete, but there's marble. And how do you say no? Because there's a sort of excitement in the office. Your house is being exhibited in model form at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's exciting. And so I think that what happened is they were going piece by piece, is kind of how Mies was describing it. They were designing it, but then as they got to those decisions and were about to construct, they would say, well, actually, this could be better if it's like this. So I certainly don't think that she was intentionally misled. And you could ask questions about, why did she feel comfortable not signing a contract at the beginning of the project? And why did she feel comfortable not knowing what the architect's fee would be? So you could ask questions. There's a real lack of clarity, I think.
It sounds like what happens in the world.
Yeah, it is. It is. But I think there was a genuine respect and appreciation for one another. they had the same social circles. They went to parties together. I think they enjoyed each other's company. So, but I think she was somebody who was kind of used to arguing for what she wanted, given the time. Only 4 women graduated from medical school per year because that was the quote-unquote female quota. So there are a lot of arbitrary gender rules that were defining her life that I'm sure she had to often argue for her voice to be heard. And this might have just felt like a betrayal to her. It's possible,
At some point, Mies wasn't evidently taking her very seriously with her feedback. And this whole thing went to court. What happened then?
Well, Mies actually took it to court. So Mies filed the lawsuit. And what's interesting about the lawsuit, he files it in July of 1951. He files the lawsuit. The first version he files asks for just the $4,000 that is owed to the mechanic. And then he revises it and says, well, actually, I would like to be paid a fee as an architect and a fee as a contractor, which were never discussed. And additionally, he put a lien on the house. So if she loses the court case, he gets to have the structure. So she countersues, of course, because she's put $70,000 into this thing and she doesn't want to lose it. So that's the nature of the trial. I don't know that she really had a choice but to countersue.
And how did the trial turn out?
Well, it wasn't a trial so much because they didn't have a jury. There was one person, Jerome. Oh, I'm forgetting his name. This is embarrassing.
The judge, you mean?
Well, actually, so the way the trial was set up, it was called a quote-unquote master in Chancery trial. So that means that somebody with trial experience sits and listens to both sides argue, hears all the depositions, the examinations, the witnesses, the evidence, and that person writes a set of findings, and those findings are then given to the presiding judge, and the judge essentially rules on the findings. So
kind of like arbitration today.
A little bit, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So this person who was in charge of, or was the master in Chancery, found in favor of Mies, submitted the findings, and the judge retired. And then the next judge who was in charge looked at it all and said, okay, well, where's the contract you two had? And they said, contract? And he said, okay, forget it. You have to settle. I can't rule on this without clear guidelines.
Without a contract, sure. Even Judge Judy tells people that today.
Oh, yeah.
Judge Judy could have saved them a lot of time.
So the first judge retired?
Yeah, that's what I understand, that he retired.
I've had enough of this?
Apparently, I'm sure. it seemed like nonsense to him. So he retired. So in the end, I think she settled. I think she pays something like $2,500 to Mies, but that's it.
It's all over.
It's all over.
When was this?
The trial it started in 1951 and lasted until, I want to say, 1953. And I think it was all wrapped up by 54, 55.
Now, Dr. Edith Farnsworth had a second enemy to fight, I believe, the Fox River.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When did that start flooding and interfering with her house?
Before construction was complete. Yeah, so one of the earliest construction photos of the house shows it with water almost up to the underside. It's lifted 5 feet off the ground. It's just sort of lifted in the air. And yeah, it was, the Fox River was flooding almost up to the interior floor of the house before the house was finished being constructed. And then I think she has the first devastating flood in 1954.
And that goes above the floor level.
Yeah, it goes right into the house above the floor. Yeah.
And this has happened half a dozen times since then, easily?
Yeah. And I would say increasingly. Just recently, I think it was summer of 2020. Alice, do you remember? Mm-hmm. I think the summer of 2020, they had a really close call. It was almost to the interior floor level.
Well, wasn't there some sort of engineering solution for this that came along later?
Well, I think that the National Trust have an interesting proposal, which is to essentially put the house on pneumatic lifts. And the idea, and I'm really simplifying it, the idea, I guess, is that if the river rises, they want to be able to push a button that will
just pump the house up.
Okay, yeah. but that hasn't been done yet.
No.
Okay,
It's
I
expensive.
remember us talking about it at some point.
Yeah, it's going to be expensive. So
No
I think
kidding.
they're trying to raise the money to do that. Yeah.
I've heard for years, and I wonder what the two of you know about this, that there was supposed to be a movie about Dr. Farnsworth and Mies. What's happening with that?
Oh, yes.
I don't know what's happening. I don't know read the updates.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening with it because at one point, wasn't it, Nora, that it was going to be Maggie Gyllenhaal and Ray Fiennes?
Oh, yeah. That'd be great.
And then Jeff Bridges got plugged in for Rafe.
Yeah, it's been a little bit of an apocryphal story that, you keep hearing about it in the next iteration and then we never see it. But, I know that years ago, the screenwriter contacted me and we talked a little bit about the story, but that was a long time ago. And then wasn't it, Nora, the most recent was like a couple of years ago where they said this thing is going forward and is, obviously COVID has probably been a factor in that as well. But I think there's a lot of interest, that's for sure.
According to IMDb, it's currently with Rafe and Elizabeth Debicki as Edith Farnsworth.
Okay.
It was originally Maggie Gyllenhaal and Jeff Bridges.
Uh-huh.
As far as I can tell, that's not really started formal production yet.
Well, it would be a great movie, but the story isn't necessarily, the real story isn't necessarily the story that they're going to want to do in Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think they're going to go with the trope version?
Oh yeah. If you read the description, it's a story of a woman who fell in love with her architect and the love child of the glass house that they made together. It's so
sounds like clickbait to me.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. It's just sort of B-movie plot line.
I remember years ago talking to someone who was involved with the production, and they floated this romance script, and I said, that doesn't really ring true. I don't think Edith was interested in marriage, and I don't think she was interested in me. And it was almost the proverbial, okay, thanks a lot. We'll get back to you at some point, Professor.
Alice, was that the screenwriter?
I don't remember. It was someone, and it was like, thanks a lot. No, we don't. We will go our own way with that because it's, the real story isn't going to sell any tickets.
Well, was there really any romance angle to this, or is that all just fiction?
No romance.
No romance. Just.
I don't think that there was. I mean, it's just. I don't know, Alice. Have you read this? That I think it's in the. Franz Schultz writes about it, that he has a quote from Laura Marks, who is Mies's longtime girlfriend in Chicago, who says that she and Mies were taking a break because they were both alcoholics, and she needed to get it under control. So she needed a break from Mies, and she believes that during their break, Mies maybe was seeing Dr. Farnsworth, but I agree with Alice. I really have a hard time believing that she was interested in me. She had friendships with and mentorships with a lot of men in her life, like throughout her life. And I think it would be really lazy to characterize those as relationships or romantic relationships. That's not the way she seems to have characterized them or thought about them. And I do think there's a lack of imagination about women in media, movies, books,
Absolutely.
All of it. And so I think that that's just how people imagine women are, that we're just boy crazy. Every man we meet is like, we're so in love,
Well, yeah,
So
Edith certainly wasn't boy crazy. We know that.
No, she was not boy crazy.
Yeah, that's so wonderful the way you put it, Nora, because, we don't know. And like many people in that period and right up to the present day, if people don't want you to know about their romantic interests, very often you don't know. There isn't evidence to go on. And I think Edith was one of those people. She was very, very private, consistent with the times. That's true of lots of people, men and women, but it's certainly true of a lot of the women that I've written about. And, I would say that you're absolutely right about Edith. You've done so much work on her, much more than I have, on who she was, on, what made her tick and what her passions were, and, what brand of cigarette she preferred and all those sorts of things. And there's not a shred of, you've never found a love letter, for example, to a man, woman, or child, right?
Well, the only thing I've ever found is she describes Eugenia Montale as her soulmate in a letter to her sister, and she wrote a love poem to Eugenia Montale. So that's as much as I can find. But I think the timing of it is really strange because she doesn't have any description of romantic feelings, inclinations toward any men in her memoir. And then at the very end of her life, when she already knows she's writing this memoir for an audience, she really, I think, understood that the house was going to be famous, and she knew that people were going to be interested in her story because the Art Institute was already trying to get its hands on her memoir and change it to make it sound like she and me were buddies.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she got a visit from John Maxon from the Art Institute when she was living in Italy, and he said to her, well, why don't you let me be the executor of your estate, and I will revise what you've written so that everybody understands that you two were best friends. And she said to her sister that it was the height of ghoulishness. And she would never let anybody do that. But at the end of her life, I think she was very aware that people wanted to know about her life. And so, like, at the very end of her life, suddenly she's describing Eugenia Montale as a soulmate to her sister in a letter that ends up in the archive. And then she's writing this, love poem to Eugenia Montale. And I don't know if it's really hard to say, like, what's authentic, what's performance? Right. Is she trying to create a narrative at the end of her life? I have no idea. So I think that's the thing I love about her is that she was so self-aware that she's constructing an identity for you. And it's hard to know what's true and what's not true. And I don't mind that. I actually really love it.
It does leave sort of a canvas upon which other people can paint their fantasies about what might have been. But
as we'll see in the movie.
I guess so.
The house was sold. Dr. Farnsworth sold it in 1968 to Lord Peter Palumbo, one of our past guests, who added air conditioning and large art installations on the grounds. Mises' grandson, Dirk Lohan, also one of our past guests, restored it in 1972 to its original 1951 appearance. It opened for tours occasionally in 1975, and a second restoration took place in 1996 after another flood devastated the interior. It was sold to Landmarks Preservation Commission of Illinois and the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 2003, who do public tours now. And it should be on everyone's bucket list to go and see it. We take people there quite frequently. Nora, Alice, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. It was really great to be here, and it was such an honor to do this with Alice, whose work really made, I think, every subsequent scholar on Edith Farnsworth made all of our work possible. So it was really an honor to join you all today.
Thank you, Nora.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. And by modernist realtor Angela Roll. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Rogue archivist Carrie Cesarino researches guests while her kids climb all over her desk and her like deranged monkeys. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with more stories of overlooked, suppressed, unsung women in architecture who deserve better on U.S. Modernist Radio.